We won't be late.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. I think we'll get started. Feel free to still get some food and bring it to your space. Very delighted to have you here, and we'll just do a quick check that the sound is coming through online. We're very delighted to have many people connecting online as well for this very happy occasion for us. This has been a book that has been in the making for a long time, and so we're very excited to have this opening event for a tour that will be going across Canada. My name is Willard Metzger, and I'm the Executive Director at Citizens for Public Justice. And to begin with, we want to acknowledge that First Nations people have lived on this part of Turtle Island for millennia, stewarding the land, the water, and all that contributes to life in this region. Today, the culture and presence of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples enrich the lands and people of this territory. More than 2 centuries ago, the Mississauga people welcomed settlers to this territory, providing sustenance and engaging in trade and commerce. Between 1781 and 1820, 8 treaties were signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who opened their territory to settlement. Today, York University's Keele campus is located on Toronto Purchase Treaty Number 13 lands and is situated on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee people. Treaty history is foundational, and it is our collective responsibility to honor the land as we honor and respect those who have gone before us, those who are here, and those who have yet to come. We are grateful for the opportunity to be learning, working, and thriving on this land, and we commit to learn the truth and be active in the process of reconciliation. So thank you all for being here. Citizens for Public Justice or CPJ is how we're commonly referred to, is a national progressive organization of members who are inspired by faith to act for social and environmental justice in Canadian public policy. CPJ and its members have been advocating for public justice in Canada for more than 60 years. And our 3 main areas of focus are eradicating poverty in Canada, climate justice, and then we incorporated refugee and migrant rights as a core policy area in the mid-1990s. And that's why we are so delighted to be able to launch this book, A Renewed Canadian Welcome. And that is a book that's published by McGill Queen's University Press and born out of CPJ's work that reimagines Canada's immigration policy through the lens of lived experience. And so I think you'll find the book very informative, I think very provocative, and looking forward as well. And this book is dedicated in memory of Stephen Kaduli. Stephen was CPJ's first permanent refugee and migrant rights policy analyst who died suddenly in 2021. And that was a big loss to CPJ, staff, and the community. And we're delighted to honor his memory and his work, his passion in the work of refugee and migrant rights. We're also very happy to have Sandra Kaduli, one of Stephen's children, here with us tonight. And so I'll invite her forward to have a few words.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. A, doing good. Well, today I stand before you to honor the life and legacy of Stephen Charles Kaduli, man whose work and values continue to inspire us long after his passing. Stephen Kaduli Charles was not only a professional in his field, but a passionate advocate for justice and human dignity. As a refugee rights policy analyst, he dedicated his life to amplifying the voices of those who are often unheard, individuals and families forced to flee their homes, such of safety, hope, and a better future. He went beyond research and policy. He was rooted in compassion. He understood that behind every statistic is a human story, a story of loss, resilience, and courage. Through his efforts, he helped shape conversations and policies that sought to protect the rights and restore the dignity of displaced people around the world. Stephen's legacy reminds us that meaningful change requires both intellect and empathy. He brought clarity to complex issues and humanity to difficult debates. In doing so, he not only informed policy but also inspired others to care more deeply and act more boldly. Even in the face of immense global changes, he remained committed to the belief that every person deserves safety, respect, and opportunity. That belief guided his work and continues to guide those who follow in his footsteps. As we remember Stephen Charles Kaduli, let us not reflect on what he accomplished, but also on what he stood for: justice, compassion, and unwavering dedication to human rights. May we carry forward his mission in our lives, speaking up for the vulnerable, advocating for fairness, and working toward a world where no one is forgotten. On behalf of all who knew and loved him, and those who will come to know him through these pages, we extend our heartfelt thanks to CPJ family. This tribute ensures that Stephen's legacy lives on, not only in memory, but in the lasting influence of this remarkable work. Thank you.
As we had mentioned, Stephen's death was a real shock to the CPJ community, and he left a mark with our organization and whoever he met. Shortly after Stephen's death, our chair of CPJ board at the time, Sherilyn Sprackman, and her husband Gary, they provided a matching grant that started the Stephen Kaduli Memorial Fund, which really was what made this book possible. And so we're very delighted to have Sherilyn and Gary here, and I think Sherilyn will share some words as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandra, for giving us a real sense of what Stephen brought to his work and to his life as he had come from Uganda and being here in Toronto and then in working for CPJ. We appreciated him so much time when he was on staff. You'll hear in what I'm going to say, you'll hear a few things that you've heard already from Willard, but I'll go ahead now. I want to thank everybody who came this evening too for the launch of Canadian welcome, a renewed Canadian welcome. So I'm Sherilyn Sprackman, and I'm former chair of the board of directors at CPJ. A renewed Canadian welcome, 11 visions from migrants and advocates, comes from the refugee rights advocacy of Citizens for Public Justice. Citizens for Public Justice is a faith-based organization founded 63 years ago. It is a mighty and small organization. In its public advocacy, research, and publications, it models the biblical call to welcome the stranger. In today's Canada, refugees and migrants, newcomers. A renewed Canadian welcome honors the memory of Stephen Kaduli. Stephen was a refugee rights policy analyst at CPJ from 2019 until 2021. Stephen was a valued and compassionate advocate for the rights of refugees and other newcomers to Canada. He had the background as a social worker, a demographer, and experience working with displaced people in his home country of Uganda. In his position at CPJ, he collaborated with many refugee rights groups and became a very respected and sought-after speaker while he was at CPJ. My husband Gary and I had the privilege of seating the Stephen Kaduli Memorial Fund. The donation started matching funds, and the fund grew. Fund paved the way for Emilio Rodriguez to begin the book, which has a recognition of being published by McGill Queen's Press. Congratulations to CPJ, staff here from CPJ, to Emilio, I think who's online with us, and to the memory of Stephen Kaduli.
And not only is this evening a launch of this book, Renewed Canadian Welcome, a recognition of all the good work that went into this and the generosity of Sherilyn and Gary, but I'm also pleased to announce that Sherilyn and Gary have offered another matching grant, and we're informing this is our launch of that as well. And so if you're have your book, and if you bought a book there, you'll see a little insert that that describes that second matching grant. And so we're hoping that you will all be a part of that to not only give a great launch of the book, but also a launch of the matching grant. So to know that every $5, $10, $50, 50,000, no. I'm very thankful for your generosity, your commitment to CPJ, your vision for refugee and migrant rights. And so very, very thankful. Thank you on behalf of CPJ. So now we move into the panel discussion, and I'll invite Rena, who is our current policy analyst for refugee and migrant rights, and has been pivotal in putting together this tour and this event tonight. So I'll let Rena come up and announce the panelists, and then move forward with that.
Thank you all for being here. The panelists can make their way up to the chairs, and I'll sit down with you in a moment. So we're pleased to have Dr. Ethel Fungahan here with us today as a panelist. She is Canada Research Chair in Canadian Migration Policy, Impacts and Activism, and is Associate Professor of Politics here at York University. She has numerous research partners with the Filipinx grassroots migrant community organizations, and her research looks at migrant labor, specifically assessing migrant activism, and she specializes in socially engaged research and is actively involved with grassroots migrant organizations such as Gabrielle Ontario and Migrante Canada. She co-authored a chapter in a Renewed Canadian Welcome called Settler Colonialism, Canadian Immigration, and Grassroots Movements for Change. Jenny Magsumbul is a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics here at York University. Her research focuses on the life experiences of the Filipino diaspora in Canada, a community of which she is also a member. Her research focus is deeply informed by her relations of care and kinship with the Filipino community in Canada and beyond. And she wrote a chapter in a Renewed Canadian Welcome called What Kind of World Do We Want to Live in conversation with activists Martha Ocampo and Senen Begon. It is an honor to have Martha here with us today as well. Martha is a decades-long advocate for migrants' rights in Canada. She is a founding member of Caregivers Connections, Education, and Support Organization, and traces her involvement to justice and advocacy work to her family's activism in the movement against then President Marcos' dictatorship in the Philippines. Please give a round of applause for So thank you all for being with me today. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your wisdom and experiences. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So a unique aspect of the book is that it brings together academics and activists. And oftentimes we see kind of a gap where books or conversations might focus mainly on the academic side of things, and others will focus mainly on activism and grassroots movements for change. And we've tried to bring people together in the same volume, both migrants, activists, and academics who also have deep connections with migrant communities themselves. And so as we talk about this, Dr. Tangahan, could you share with us a bit about how your connections and roles in both academic spaces as well as community groups strengthens advocacy efforts in these spaces, and why is the bridge between academia and the grassroots so important?
Thank you so much, Rena, for your question. I'm going to try to project because I see that people are having a hard time hearing a little bit. I'm just seeing the chat. People online, can you hear me now? Is this better? I'm not seeing any more messages.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So we're going to have to use our teacher voices, right? We've got to project. First of all, congratulations to everyone for their role in the book. I think this is definitely a landmark contribution because all of the chapters talk about activism and also academic research. Rita was the one who invited me to come, and I was very, very honored to co-author a chapter with her. And I also think, in answer to your question, I've always said that my alliances lie with the community first and with migrant communities first. I myself came here with my parents in 1999 under Canada's, at that point system. And I realized after witnessing, my parents' experiences of deprofessionalization and de-skilling, that it's important for us not only to do more research on the lives of immigrants, newcomers, and migrants, research coming from immigrants, migrants, and newcomers themselves, but also to use such research as a way to fuel our advocacy and lobbying efforts. I've always identified as what we call a socially engaged researcher. So I find that it's important for us to look beyond the academy and look beyond academic research. So looking beyond journal articles, which 5 people read, right? And thinking more about how to channel our research towards social good and community activism. And so I find that, the research we undertake can actually help with movement building. And we can perhaps talk a little bit more about that later. But I do think it's important for us to also think about, the world beyond this ivory tower, and to think about how we can channel the work that we're doing towards advocacy efforts.
Thank you very much. And as we talk about these connections between academia and the grassroots, we can also talk about connections between the global and local. And so, Martha, I'm wondering if you could share with us all, how are the justice movements that you've been involved in connected between transnationally, and why is that important to recognize?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I made some notes, but my activism started way back in the 70s when I was part of the movement against the Marcos dictatorship. And through that work, I immediately learned that it was important to be somehow connected with other movements in all over the world. So we became very involved in solidarity work with the African National Congress, for example, different solidarity work with Latin American national liberation movements. And so I think it was something that was inherent in doing this kind of work, justice movement. So I came here as a nurse, and very early on, I already noticed how much I was experiencing a lot of discrimination, which I didn't even realize it was discrimination. I didn't know what racism was. That was something that we didn't talk about in my college days, my university days. But I could really feel that there was such a difference on how I was treated from the other staff that was working in the hospital. So it was natural for me to become involved with the care workers. We used to call them caregivers, but I think it is really important that we call them care workers because they are working with contracts they have employers, and very often they are referred to as caregivers. Caregivers usually are relatives not paid, but they are paid. So there's a big difference between a care worker that's having an employer and an employee kind of relationship. So the work that we find, the issues that are being dealt with by care workers are not isolated. They're very much related to the different movements. So when we talk about poverty, for example, they came here because of poverty. They came here sacrificing to be separated from their families. And yet, here we are also experiencing poverty. Currently, it's very important that we look at affordability issue. That's an issue for care workers. And what happens? It's the vulnerable people like care workers and migrant workers that are being blamed, that are being scapegoated as the reason why there is crisis. They never look at the owners of lab laws or the corporate world. Where they're the ones, if you look at the census, they're always making profit. They're not losing anything. So I think that these issues of care workers are very much related to the other issues that are happening in the world. Fairness, the vulnerability, the exploitation. Exploitation is an issue that has been from day one. And when care workers ask for fair wage, immediately there's a lot of grumbling. Why are they asking? They are just working, domestic workers. They're just doing this, they're just doing that. They are employees. They are employees. And yet they are exploited. They work so many hours. They're not paid for their extra work that they do on the weekends or during the night. And again, these are things that are so familiar, and somehow we don't seem to look at it, how these are all correlated with what is happening today. So let me know if my time is happening.
That's great.
I can get going with
If you have something that you'd like to add quickly, let's.
Oh, okay. So I think that what is happening today in terms of as the services are being cut, health services, education, legal services, and the ones that are really suffering are people like care workers, migrant workers, people who are here temporary workers, temporary foreign workers. And so I really think that when you look at money being spent on militarization, on defense, it just takes away all these other needs that it needs to be somehow addressed. And I think that this issue is not also new, although it's a very different world that we are having. War. We have been waging war for such a long time. Poverty, I think, is a war against the poor. And mothers leaving their families, separated for many, many years away from their families. That's just a big thing. And yet, people don't even look at the mental health, how women are suffering and how the separation from families. And so I think when they actually get reunited, it's an issue that is being not being addressed. Because now, settlement agencies, the ones who look after newcomers, care workers, refugees, will actually cut. I think you saw that in the news recently. So I don't really know what they're expecting for people. When people start having mental health issues, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? But anyway, later on, I'm going to talk a little bit on some of the things we have done to somehow to empower women, to get them to know how to resolve some of these issues. Although I think the policies is something that we need to really change.
Well, thank you for illuminating some of those connections for us, Martha. I really appreciate that. And kind of along similar lines, Danny, I'm wondering if you can explain a bit more. You talk in your chapter about the connection between local working conditions for migrants and global politics. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that and why recognizing those connections is so important in justice movements.
One of the ways that we see global connections and local connections is actually the intimacy of families, as they say. So my mom came to Canada as a caregiver. She actually moved here through the live-in caregiver program. And as was happening with many live-in caregivers, my mom met a lot of administrative problems. Moving from abusive employers to the next one wasn't easy. The system is not made to be easy because it's supposed to, avoid fraud or things of this nature. But what was happening is that people like my mom were experiencing things like starvation, we'll name it. But what it is, she had an employer, for example, who locked the fridge and kept the key around her neck so that my mom couldn't sneak in more food. And so my mom would spend her first year in Ottawa every night leaving the home, going to the nearest, what do you call this? Not bodegas, just like a food place. And she would buy, she tells the story, she would buy a chocolate bar and a small bottle of Fanta, eat half the chocolate bar, drink half the bottle of Fanta, sit on a bus stop and cry. And then repeat that every night because she was being starved. She was doing all of the care work, all the care labor for the family that employed her, which was illegal, by the way, because according to the contract, you're only caring for the child or the elderly person that you were contracted for. But she was, taking care of the entire family. And so what she was experiencing, in addition to the separation that our family was going through, we were separated for a very long time, was also violence that was enacted on her in Canada because she wouldn't be experiencing this kind of essentially, labor infractions upon her if she wasn't here, and specifically under the auspices of the live-in caregiver program. And this is a story that is familiar. A lot of caregivers have gone through this. Breaking the Silence, I think, is one book that speaks about this very intimately. My master's research, I also spoke to other women who were also living care workers who had gone through the same thing. But to bring it back to your question, I think we can find that connection between global labor and local labor demands in the family. And that's where we see the stresses of such demands being enacted on families. And as Tita Martha was saying, when we think about reunification is a long process. When you've been separated for a very long time, my family was separated for, I think, over a decade. And then by the time we met, we reunited, I was 19 and my brother was 16. And so, think about who you were when you were 16 and 19 and you don't know how to be a child anymore to a parent who doesn't know how to be your parent because they have been parenting other people. And so in that labor demand for care and for domestic work, what is happening is the separation of the family that is happening transnationally. And then by the time that we meet and we attempt to repair all of these things, there isn't a lot of support on how to do that because families have to relearn how to be family with each other at times. And so I think the short answer to your question is family. The intimacy is where we see global effects.
You could share. So as we talk about these all kinds of different connections, Dr. Tanahan, I'm wondering if you can share with us some of the principles that researchers and advocates should employ so that avoid exploiting the voices and experiences of communities that they're representing and advocating for. So we see that it's important to be connected to these communities. How do we make sure as researchers or advocates that their voices aren't being exploited?
Thank you so much for that question. I think, Danny's response is making me think as well that we can't assume that, communities over there and academia is over there, right? Like increasingly what we're witnessing is a lot of people who have lived experiences of migration and who are also advocates are also themselves taking on the hard work of doing research, right? So, let's not kind of assume that there's a clear-cut separation. And also I find that a lot of the battles for social change are also being waged in universities. I know, for example, York University, is at the forefront of a lot of labor struggles, right? I find that it's inspiring talking to students, student activists, student organizers who understand that they also are trying to fight for a better world, but also within the university. So, just kind of caveats. But I think in terms of kind of principles to ensure that that we try to avoid extractive research. I think one thing that I've noticed in my time in the academy is that a lot of community members, and perhaps Tita Martha can agree with this, find that academics lurk around and are like vultures who try to extract research in order to advance their careers and don't go back to the community to let them know what they found, right? So at the most basic level, after you've built a relationship with community members, with newcomers, immigrants, because we all know that research is about relationships, to then be like ghosted and find out that after months of kind of getting interviews and sharing these interviews and insights, you don't even have the courtesy of going back and saying, this is what I found. I find that that's something that community members, newcomers, refugees, migrants have said explains the reluctance to be part of academic projects, right? So let's just kind of make that clear. I also find that we need to think about, as academics, the fact that when people say yes to working with us, that's an honor and a privilege. And we should actually, instill an awareness of research ethics going beyond university ethics research boards, right? In other words, just because people sign a consent form doesn't mean that ethics stops there, right? So we have to think about ethics, a more expansive notion of ethics beyond kind of administrative documents. I also think, and perhaps this is something more for researchers who share the same identities as the communities they're researching with, sometimes we need to think, as we're doing this research, are these stories meant to be shared publicly? So in other words, Indigenous scholars have actually been really good at outlining the importance of decolonial research methods, where you actually say there are stories for us and stories for them, right? Stories for us, sometimes not everything needs to be published, not everything deserves to be disseminated. And so those are just a few of my thoughts when it comes to the question. I'm sure we can talk more about that, but yeah, I think it's also really important to kind of ask yourself, I mean, there's the academic arms race as well, right? Like I recognize that in order to get a job in the job market, you have to have certain amounts of publications, right? Like I understand the pressures facing people who are about to graduate. Danny will soon get her PhD. Shout out to Danny, right? And Ataleni will soon get her master's, right? Do you know what I mean? And so I understand the pressures and the demands, and the time and tempo of academic research doesn't neatly coincide with the time and tempo of like activism, right? And so I don't know, there are decisions that we have to make. And I think, what I always kind of think to myself is, will I be able to look myself in the mirror in terms of the decisions I make about what to publish and what not to publish. But it's a hard line to draw. And I welcome thoughts from people here maybe later too. And Ate Martha.
Actually, I want to add that as a community organizer, I think that researchers are also very important. But I think because of this very bad experience of communities, they are kind of distancing themselves, or they are very almost paranoid when a researcher comes in and wants to do something really nice. But I think it is a process. It's not like the researcher comes in and then asks a question and then goes and then writes the report. No, I think it's a process. And so I think even community organizers like me, I need to also be educated and try to understand the role of researchers. Because sometimes I laugh when I tell researchers, I say, okay, come talk to us, go down and articulate what you heard from us, and come back and tell us again. So, because we don't have time to articulate this in paper, but we are the ones that are organizing in the community. So there has to be that kind of very kind of a cooperative kind of relationship, because I think one needs the other. It's not like one is in somewhere. One of the sad things that we actually experienced with like care workers very early on was when care workers do not have a voice, because there's this very academic lawyers and all that speaking on their behalf. So as a result, the care workers said, I don't know what you're talking about. So there's that distancing because they are not owning it. They have to own it. And so I think there is that need to really work together and appreciate each other.
Yeah, thank you. And part of like the next question I was going to ask you is like, why, if you could expand even a bit further on why is it so important that researchers are deeply rooted in the communities in meaningful and ethical ways? Like, why is that so important that there's not just this gap of here's what they think the community is experiencing versus here's what the community is saying? Why is it so important that they have these long-term relationships that are deeply connected with the community that they are representing or advocating for?
Because I think there's a history of that distancing. There's history of how academia kind of distance themselves. They're kind of in the tower, and here are the people. I think it is important that they are. It's even better if they are they are member of that community.
Yeah.
But sometimes that might not be possible. So I think there has to be that, because I think community organizers also need to understand that. Because sometimes, we think that we know all this. No, we need some people to help us articulate some of these thoughts. We need some theoretician. One of the things that I really learned when I was working with the Marcos dictatorship was we had theoreticians. They were the ones that were helping us understand our strategy, understand what is going on. And that helped us when we go out in the community and then do the work.
Thank you very much. And as we think about advocacy efforts that are rooted in communities most affected by immigration policies, I've noticed that oftentimes in public discourse, there can be this misleading dichotomy between refugees and migrants, where we're viewing refugees as forced migrants and other migrants as purely voluntary migrants. How could, Danny, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to how is this dichotomy misleading, and why is it important to include the concerns of temporary migrant workers, for example, in conversations about immigration policy?
It also assumes a lot of use of people who are migrants. I think just to situate this, my dissertation, I spoke to families, so I spoke to sibling pairs and married couples. Essentially how it shook out was that I was looking at the experiences of parents and children And so when we think about agency and migration and willingness to do so, I think one of the things that gets overlooked perhaps is the children of migrant families. When you don't have a choice in the matter, you're not a refugee, you are the child of a migrant family. How do we think about that in terms of integration? If at its very best, Canada is a country that encourages integration into, our multicultural society, what does that mean when you have children who weren't really asked in these decision-making processes to be like, would you like to come to Canada? Or what is life going to look like for you when you come to Canada? And so when I spoke to migrants who were youth at the time, I were now in their 20s, one of the things that emerged, for example, is a loss of identity, not necessarily because Canada isn't multicultural, but because when you arrive as a 7-year-old and you speak your language, by the time you're 22 and you've been through an educational system that tries to hammer out the accent out of your tongue, you've lost it. And then you're 21, sort of looking at your childhood and being like, what would life have looked like for me if I had stayed in the Philippines, or if my family hadn't been essentially forced to make the decision to move to the Philippines. I think by many standards, my mom wouldn't be thought of as a coerced migrant. She did come of her own accord. She was an adult when she was making these decisions. She went to Hong Kong first, then she came to Canada. But at the very core of it, one of the reasons that she left the Philippines was because of poverty. She wasn't able to support myself and my younger brother in the way that she thought she could do that, and buy us the better future that all parents, I assume, want for their children, was for her to engage in this speculative behavior of buying a better future by gambling on her present. And sometimes that works out, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think, to your point, thinking about an agency of migrants and the way that migrants make decision-making processes beyond this idea that migrants only make decisions based off of money. That's not the only reason they do this. Or the way that we, for example, in academia have split this idea of rational decision-making and emotional decision-making, as though these weren't things that we use with our full faculties to come to decisions of migration. So I think you're right to point out that this dichotomy of choice, perhaps, reflects in how we view refugees and migrants, certainly in mainstream media, right? The way that it is reported in the news or sensationalized on social media. And we even see this, I think, in the discourse around international students. That I hear, like, I'm sure people have seen this on TikTok or Instagram or wherever you want your social medias. But yeah, I think to bring this back also to questions of ethics, we really have to bring in migrant voices. Like it is not. I don't think it is ethically. I don't think it is possible for ethical research to happen when it's one and done. When you speak to a community and then you leave afterwards, I don't think that is ethical. At least my understanding of ethics in research is reciprocity and continuity. You create these relationships perhaps with institutions, perhaps with people, and that's how you continue to grow and learn alongside invention.
Thank you very much for those insights, and I appreciate the point you made about children too. That's a really interesting connection to be reflecting on. So as we think about advocacy and activism efforts, it can sometimes feel like discouraging and slow work. So Dr. Tangahan, I'm wondering if you can share with us an example or two about grassroots activism that has successfully shifted immigration policy.
I mean, for those who haven't bought the book yet, buy the book. It's threaded through with beautiful examples of how church groups and civil society, private citizens have been, really making demands on the Canadian state and even transnational organizations to promote migrant justice. We all know that when it comes to easing immigration restrictions, it was humanitarian groups and church groups who were at the helm. We all know that Canada they preferred European migrants, right? And you know, in the 1950s, it was church groups and humanitarian groups who actually really advocated and said, no, we need to ease immigration restrictions, right? So we need to be mindful of that history. Tita Martha sitting here next to us, you know, she is one of the leaders for care activism here in the country. One thing I often have to keep reminding people is that the right for care workers, migrant care workers, to apply for Canadian citizenship was never freely given by the state, right? It took a lot of advocacy by care workers and care advocates, including stories which I got for my research from activists, you know, going to restaurants where ministers are eating and being like, why are you not giving care workers the right to permanent residency? So it's through these concerted actions that caregivers receive the right to apply for Canadian citizenship in the first place. You know, there's also micro moments of resistance where, I mean, it might seem minor in the scheme of things, but, you know, in like 2017, 2018, there were a lot of activists, as well as people who wanted to come to Canada, but found that medical inadmissibility requirements were so high, such that they've lived and worked in Canada for years and then claim, you know, their children with disabilities, right? And the Canadian government said, we don't want them in Canada because they present a burden. But because of concerted advocacy, although the medical inadmissibility clause under the immigrant, like IRPA, under the law is still intact, they kind of lowered the admission criteria so more people can qualify. I will say though, and I don't think it's unfair for me to say this, but the fight still continues, right? Earlier today, I was reading about how because of the war taking place all over the world, we are going to face an increased demand for humanitarian admissions in the country, right? But if you have a look at Bill C-12, and if you have a look at present day policies, I find that now we really need to kind of come together and make demands, because it's going to be harder and harder. It is harder and harder for people to come in through all different streams, all different immigration streams, right? So taking a look at history and looking at the clear successes we've had should give us inspiration, I don't know, to send Mark Carney an email, right? And ask, what are you doing? You know, I do think that we can't be complacent. Canada has always kind of patted itself on the back as being a welcoming country, a welcoming state. I don't think that's going to be true. Not that it was historically true, it was only true for some groups. So I do think looking at these activist examples should actually inspire us to still be active and still do more and still lobby and advocate.
It is inspiring. Yeah, thank you very much for just a few of those many examples that can inspire us as we look to continue moving forward. And so as we look to continuing the good fight, Martha, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about, so in Danny's chapter, which she wrote in conversation with you, mentioned the importance of incorporating moments of Kwentahan. I don't know if can you tell us more about what this is and why this is important in effective advocacy?
So during the pandemic, people were really socially isolated, especially care workers who were, aside from being away from their families, they could not get in touch with their families. They're so isolated, they could not even go out to buy their own food. They had to eat the food of their employer, which sometimes is just unfair. Anyway, and then they're just kept in the room. They're socially isolated. So one of the things that we thought, and I think again, thank you for our work in the anti-fascist movement, where we think of many different things, different kinds of strategy on how we can get people to be heard. How can we try and change the existing policy that is so horrible. In this particular case, I think because of the social isolation, we had to think of what can we do? So we thought of a support group. And again, because it was not easy to be in person, we learned Zoom. We learned Zoom, and that was one of the things that we actually learned to do. And but I think kwentuhan, we call it kwentuhan, it's storytelling. It is very familiar to Filipinos. Gathering of people, they tell their stories, sad, good, laughter, lots of laughter. And sometimes they also have, very often they have food. And in this, we were able to really support women who were so depressed. They were on the verge of severe mental disorder. And I think them having the opportunity to be listened to talk to people, to hear others that they're also experiencing the same thing, and really just tell stories after another. And that became really a very good tool that we use for people to be more sociable, to socialize. Because socialization is, I think, even before the pandemic, that's already something that care workers experience a lot because they are, especially in the live-in caregiver program, where they were supposed to just live with their employers. And, that's a horrible thing. And they are supposed to just stay with one employer, even if they are abused, then severely exploited. So I think that trying to find ways for people to be able to somehow socialize. So, especially Filipino women, they like to also dance. So when we had the opportunity to be together, we would do it in the park. And we would start first with some physical kind of activity, whatever that will help them. And then we would sit down and share stories. And I think it became like a big thing that until today we have kwentuhan every month. And people look forward to it. So are we having kwentuhan? So we now have a flyer every month. It's distributed because we know that people are looking forward. And kwentuhan is not just sharing stories, it's sharing information, education. So for example, BC12 that Ethel is talking about, we need to be educated what that C12 is because it's going to affect us. It's going to affect each one of us. And so education is so important. That's also part of kwentuhan. Sharing information. And again, I think the other thing is that the social media is very bad sometimes. Misinformation, disinformation. And a lot of our folks tend to use social media. So I think that occasion like that, we're able to provide them the real story or the real good information to what they read in the.
That's really neat. Thank you for sharing that. And in closing, Danny, I wonder if you could share what some of the calls to action from temporary migrant workers and their allies currently are. What are things that sitting in the room and watching online, what are the calls to action that we can be engaging in and joining in?
I think as citizens for public justice, what I assume all of us in this room are, a thing that we can do that is at our disposal is to email our representatives. Send that email, make that call, because what is happening is affecting all of us. And in the most, in the best way that we can participate in democracy, we have to be able to do these things, even if it's just sending these emails or, again, making these calls. Volunteer, find an organization that needs your skills, because as I'm sure Tita Martha can attest to, there are many spaces that need or necessitate whatever it is that you can provide as a skill. And like as Tita Martha was saying about disinformation and information, I think we also need to be able to speak to our family members about this, because you don't know what for example, what your social media bubble is telling you is different from what your mom's social media might be, or your brother's social media might be. And we have seen a lot of gender specific streams that are happening. That recent documentary on the Manosphere, for example, and the way that our young men are being targeted is very worrisome to me. I have a younger brother, and we talk about this all the time, but like, we have to be able to make the connection between our intimate spaces, our families, our relations, our kin, and our communities, and the way that we can mobilize these relationships into something that we can hold and send to the people that are governing us. So, even if it seems silly, like, make that call, write that email. Like, if you're in Ontario, man, Doug Ford is going after our science centers, going after our students. OSAP is, as someone who was raised by a person who came in as my worker, my mom was my worker. She was also a single mother. I could not have gotten the education I did without OSAP. Like, the reason that I am, doing my PhD is because of things like OSAP. And so, as Martha was saying, all of this is connected. All of the things that we are experiencing are interconnected, which means that there are multiple ways of strategizing for common problems. So one thing that I've heard is that the antidote to despair is community. So I think we have to find wherever it is that we can contribute, wherever it is that we can find a place for our skills. And a lot of the time that might be volunteering, or finding these organizations. And very specifically, if you are feeling called towards, migrant workers, care workers, Gabriela is out there, Anak Bayan is out there for this very Filipino specific. But there are, that's what I'm trying to say to wrap that up, is find your community and contribute to your community.
Let's give it up a round of applause. Take a moment to take some questions. So if you have a question, if you could just say which panelist you would like to direct it to, and then your question, and anyone online, you can put a question in the chat and we'll try to address some of those as well. Any questions to start us off? Yes.
Yeah, hello everyone. So my name is James. I'm a PhD student in Communication and Media Study here at York. So I study media for ethnic minorities in Canada. So I have a question for Martha. So how do you see digital platforms like Facebook, Instagram in shaping the organization of social activism? Is it easier with digital platforms, or is it harder because of the misinformation and disinformation online?
Well, to start with, digital information is not easy because we're more used to communicating, especially in our language, right? But I think because this is the world we are in now, we are forced to learn. And so one of the things that we do really is for people to become more educated and be able to learn how to use technology to their advantage. So, of course, there's social media. But what does social media do to you? Where do you get your information? So we make that kind of distinction because it is important for people to understand that it's very, if you are trying to make a change, especially policy change, systemic change, you have to find the correct information, the correct, based from research, to be able to provide that kind of education. So I think that, yes, it's hard for people that are coming from with a different kind of culture, different kind of language. But you see, like when I talk about kwentuhan, we use the word in order for people to understand what it means. However, in our discussion, we speak in English, we speak in our language. It's like mixed. And some of the things that we have done, for example, in theater, because a lot of people will not be just Filipinos. So it's a mixed group of people. So we might be able to ask a question in English, but answer in our language. So that way people understand what it is you are trying to do. I hope that helps you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful panel. Thank you for sharing all your experience, all your lived experience, and especially Denny's story about how she come to joining the PhD journey, probably. I have two questions for both Denny and Professor. Is there any moment that you feel disappointed or frustrated on your journey on researching the community that's so close to you? How do you pass through it?
Frustrated or disappointed, right?
Yeah, maybe not by the community, but the reality they're facing.
I think that because I came to the research with a very specific like positionality, like I was very open, like, oh, you know, this is my background. I came as an immigrant with my mom. This was my mom's situation. I think it wasn't. I'm trying to think of like the word frustration and sort of uproot that from like a personal frustration to like a community-wide frustration. That why are we all going through these same things? This is obviously or evidently very systemic, and the effects of this are felt both intimately and externally, you know, local and transnational things. And so a lot of the stories that were shared, and I was thinking about, you know, Professor Donald's point that some of this is not for public consumption. Like some of the stories that we share with like our community members are not intended to be shared beyond. And so part of your responsibility as a researcher, I think, is to be able to tell which stories are not, what won't make it to paper. And there's a lot of migration trauma that I'm not willing to put in because I'm not willing to write migration porn, essentially, or trauma porn. That, like, you know, even though we are all going through such similar troubles and needs, and our parents are also, I'm not willing to paint the community in only one brushstroke. I'm not willing to depict the Philippines as like this sort of abject community that is suffering because of migration, because, you know, that's not who we are. And so there's a way of, I think, or I'm learning as I'm writing and editing and revising, that there's a way to tell these stories that foreground migrant experiences without giving in to this mainstream notion that Filipinos in Canada are only, you know, care workers or laborers. So that's, I think, when I think of the word frustration and disappointment, these are the things that.
Yeah, so when I think about frustration and disappointment, I mean, I think of two things immediately. I'm not so much frustrated necessarily with the communities I'm working with, although I'll talk about that in a second. I'm frustrated with how it's 2026, but the battles remain the same. In fact, the battles are a little bit harder. Mm-hmm. I find that when it comes to wearing kind of the immigration policy making hat, it's harder and harder for the Canadian public to have a say when it comes to immigration decision making. Power is centralized such that ministerial decision making rules. So there's not even public conversations about what we want in terms of, you know, our society, right? And I find that really, really incredibly frustrating. And I find that, you know, and perhaps, you know, Tita Martha can talk about this too, but you can never let your guard down. You know what I mean? Like I find that when it comes to migrant activism, especially concerning migrant domestic work, but also temporary foreign workers program, right? The same discourses that historically have labeled some groups of migrants as being unwelcome and unsuitable to Canada. So here I'm thinking about South Asian migrants who were barred from entry through the Continuous Journey Act under Komagata Maru, the BC Children's Exclusion Act. The same rhetoric is still existing, except now it's in more contemporary forms. So history keeps repeating itself, and that's incredibly frustrating. And sometimes I feel we like to think that we're making progress, and yet it seems as though we've moved all the way back, right? So that's kind of my frustration as well. And how the terms set by like fascists, I'm kind of worried that we're accepting without questioning, for example, the need for greater border security. Why are we accepting the need for these new technologies to surveil people, to surveil borders? I just kind of question that. My second frustration, so perhaps this is also an answer to your question. I'm doing a lot of work looking at digital platforms and TikTok as a source of online hate. I think one frustration that I have, and I've shared with some of you in this room, is the way that these digital platforms promote discourses that are vehemently anti-immigrant, very xenophobic, very racist, but they target immigrant communities. And some of the TikToks that we saw, my research team and I saw, are TikToks being shared by immigrants themselves, right? So anti-immigrant immigrants sharing the most anti-immigrant rhetoric through TikTok, thus contributing to anti-immigrant sentiment. And so that to me is just frustrating, because you would imagine that people, and Mohammed, Melissa, and I have talked about this as well with respect to international students, right? Like, you know, people who were able to get permanent residency through the Canadian Experience class, now we're saying, no, but the international students today, we don't want them to come in. And you're like, wait, hold on, but you came in as an international student under the CEC. You know, and this is true as well for research among, you know, forced migrants, right? Like, you know, it's the same discursive construction of the good migrant versus the bad migrant, the good refugee versus the bad refugee. And I find that I'm not frustrated with individual communities themselves, but I find it frustrating that we keep repeating history and we can't seem to like go beyond these like bifurcated notions of good immigrants, bad immigrants. That to me is incredibly frustrating.
Yes, the first station. I just want to add, because I think advocacy is it's not an easy word. But one of the things that I think is so important is that people become self-advocates, need to be educated about even their own history. You know, one of the things that I feel that we need to do is to really sit down among ourselves and understand our history, the impact of colonization. Why, after we are immigrants ourselves, we are also anti-immigrant? Why are we doing that? Racism is obviously on the works. You know, so I think that advocacy is not an easy thing to do, but we have to start within ourselves. We have to first educate ourselves. What is it that we want? What is it that we want to change? And why are we thinking like this? What's our history? Why do we love the white people? You know, like, what is it? So I think there are so many things that need to be unraveled first before we can become really, but I think self-advocacy is important. So the key is to first empower the women, empower the care workers, empower the migrant workers to understand why are they here, what made them come here, what's their history, and then perhaps they can begin to look at the policies that's affecting them. And that's where they will begin to make that change. Just going to say that.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. My name is Patrick King. I'm a CGI and I work with Hope for Refugees International. I love this conversation. I find it extremely very thoughtful, insightful, but very informative as well. I came in pretty late, so I don't know the names of who's speaking. But I was quite intrigued by some of the conversations. And I have a question, but I also want to first share some thoughts on what I completely agree with from what you're sharing. I think there's so much progress that has been made over time. But what we're seeing right now is that it's being eroded with some of the bills and policies and rhetoric that we're seeing going forward. You gave a very good example of OSIP. We are also seeing current policy conversations around the interim federal health program, or where you want to rip healthcare from these refugees. Some of them come here when they don't. Takes them some of them until 6 months to even get a work permit to find a job, and so pretty difficult. And somehow it makes me think whether our immigration policies are designed from an ideological perspective, and also looking at things like a human rights-based perspective, but also putting people at the center. But also understanding that I think there is this whole agenda that the conservative far right, far left movement that has had over time on how they need to shape societies like North America and Europe and others based on prioritizing this privileged white or colored person, right? But also I think we are coming to a time where we need to acknowledge that there's a lot that has changed over time, just like technology has changed over time. So when you look at cities like Toronto or like New York and others, where you have more than almost 40% of your population being immigrants, without any question, and these are guys who are kind of like driving the agenda, whether it is in urban planning, education, and all over the place, and then you're still stuck to I don't even want to call it colonial, but even like before colonial perspective of designing policy, right? And I think this is what makes it, like I was recently thinking about Doug Ford's idea about cutting OSOP in a society where right now the costs of living are almost unbearable for everyone, from rent to groceries to healthcare. And now you want to cut OSOP. And I'm like, can't there just be a way to say that, okay, if you are getting OSAP and you're not completing your program, you pay back the loan, or rather the grant as well, as simple as that. But you let people who want to take advantage, rather utilize OSAP to be able to acquire education. I'm in school right now. Honestly, if it wasn't for OSAP, I wouldn't be doing my master's, right? And besides, we know that it's not all free money. Part of it, we gotta pay it back. But my question is, looking at the current, policy landscape, can we entrust the future of migration with politicians? And because we know they make a lot of power, right? But and if that isn't the case, how do we strike the line, right? In terms of penetrating who becomes a politician, but also who makes decision, right? Like how do we penetrate the liberal agenda right before it's even presented at the different spheres of decision making? How do we penetrate the Conservative Party agenda? Yeah, I would be interested in some of your thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. No, we cannot entrust the future of migration policy to elected officials. I mean, it's hard, right? Because I think, honestly, like as a political science professor, one thing that has become increasingly clear is that politicians don't really care about temporary labor migration issues, about refugee issues. And I've had people tell me that off the record because they say, but they're not voting, right? Mm-hmm. Migrant workers don't vote, right? Asylum seekers don't vote. So why should I care when I really want to just respond to the constituents who I'm serving, right? So that's the very, very cynical answer that I've been getting. I also think we need to look beyond Canada and look at global trends as well. Whatever is happening in other states, Canada is replicating, and whatever is happening in Canada, other states are doing as well. So, there's a lot of attention being brought on Donald Trump and ICE, right? But we also need to look at Canadian policy and the ramped up powers that are now going to be given to border agencies under Bill C-12, right? So my biggest frustration sometimes is when people are like, oh, at least we're not the US. And I'm like, oh, well, that's a really low bar, but also, have a look at what's happening in terms of the discourse surrounding migration. And I find that, migrants are an easy scapegoat. In a time of, and refugees are a very easy scapegoat, right? In a time of economic crises, this is why when we were talking about international students, it gets me so angry because up until 2023, Canada, through the Canadian Express Entry Program, said, look, we want our future citizens to be international students. But because of divisive rhetoric concerning international students now being blamed for the housing crisis, they flipped the switch, right? And now we have countless of international students who are self-deporting, despite the fact that they, saw IRCC's website saying, you're welcome to come here, right? So, I think what's really frustrating is that how do we infiltrate these parties? How do we infiltrate the policy agenda? This is why, quite honestly, not to plug the book again, I think this shows the importance of alliance building, right? Mm-hmm. I think even though sometimes it gets frustrating for me, to talk to some so-called allies, because sometimes people come in and say, look, I want to be helpful when it comes to migrant workers. I want to help out care workers, but they come at it from a really colonial, perspective. And I'm like, that's icky. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, sometimes I'm like, you want to help, but you're looking at people who you want to help, so they're the other, that they don't have agency. I think there's conversations we can have about how we can make sure that such alliances are more horizontal and aren't based on colonial relationship building. So we actually still need to forge these conversations with people who can vote, right? And I honestly think, politicians are so swayed by public opinion too. So I find that, one thing from the care workers movement that, I learned as a researcher and as an advocate is sometimes shaming really does help, right? Pointing out cases of government hypocrisy, which then allows you to shift the needle. So, I'm sure there are other examples that people can think of where shaming actually led to a decisive change in policy, but it's hard. It's hard. I don't know if other people have insights here, but I'm just sitting here I feel really cynical and really quite depressed actually when thinking about, the state of the world.
I feel the frustration and it's justified.
Well, I think that concludes our panel for this evening. So let's thank our panelists again for taking the time.
Indeed, thank you very much. Each one very insightful, as you said, very informative and inspiring. So I'm sure if you have bought a book, I'm sure, and if you haven't yet, you can get one at the back. And I'm sure that each of the panelists would be willing to sign the book if they are asked for that in their corresponding chapters or whatever. So yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And a reminder again of the exceptional generosity of the Sprackmans in the matching grant. So let's tonight too. Every little bit we'll get matched tonight up to $20,000. So wow. Thank you very much. That's very good. Thank you again, Sandra, for coming. Means a lot to us very much. Thank you very much. And again, for all those involved. So go out and let's make things happen. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Refugee, I just got that wrong, right?
The Center for Refugee Studies.
Yes, thank you for the Center for Refugee Studies and hosting this, making this possible. And students that are helping here, thank you.